Hi, I'm Andy Keeler. Welcome to the UNC Coastal Studies Institute. We're delighted you're here. This is part of our every month last or next to last Thursday Science on the Sound series. This content is available on the web, as are the past ones, and so I encourage all of you to look at them and to continue to come to this great series that John McCord, who's running the board in the back, organizes and puts on. My name is Andy Keeler. I'm your speaker today. I'm the head of the public policy program here at UNC Coastal Studies Institute. I also am a professor of economics at East Carolina. I've been here on the Outer Banks for about 6 years. I was actually born in Chapel Hill, so I've spent about 2/3 of my life in the South and over half of it in North Carolina. And I can't tell you how delighted I've been to be back here for the last 6 years, working on a number of really important issues with great colleagues that I think are really essential to the coast, and especially to this part of the coast. What I'm going to talk about today is sea level rise, and how at least I see and how I think it's useful to think about the balance between what we do as individuals, what public policy does, and the kinds of choices we're going to be facing. And I can give this away to start with. I don't know the answers. I've been studying this for 11 years. I've been doing it down here for 6 years. Like a lot of academics, I have a big ego, and usually when I study something for this long, I think I know the answers. But for adaptation in this ever-changing, uncertain environment, I don't know. But I think I've learned a little bit about good ways to think about it and good things to focus on as we form our opinions. So that's what I'll be trying to get across today. This is not a talk on science. I'm not a scientist. I don't play one on TV. I really don't even own a white lab coat. But you can't talk about climate change without talking about the scientific basis. So I'm going to do a very brief overview of climate science, or at least the way we're going to think about it in terms of approaching policy, and then get on to adaptation. And I think there's three key parts of adaptation that we need to understand all fit in. There's what individuals do when individuals and businesses make choices. There's the way they interact through markets, and I'm going to be focusing on real estate markets. And then there are public policies, which are really essential. And a lot of the focus on climate change that people talk about are, what's the government going to do? What are planners going to do? People are going to tell us what to do. And I think that's an essential part of it, but I'm going to try to put it in a perspective that I think makes sense. There are some key issues then we have to deal with. The most important one to me is time and timing. What we do in some sense matters pretty much about the same as when we do it, and I think that's a really key choice. I'll talk about that. Path dependence, the choices we make now set us on a path that influences the future. I think that's another key factor. A couple of other key things: certainty versus flexibility in public policy, compensation and incentives. If we have time, and I promise you we won't, I'll show you actually some of the modeling we've done with a bunch of graphs and equations, but I think rather than that, we'll actually go to group discussion and questions. So I guess what I'd encourage us to do is if something I'm saying makes absolutely no sense and you need or even if there's a clarifying question, please ask. But if not, please hold questions or discussion till the end, and there'll be plenty of time for that. Okay. John, is the sound coming through okay? Great. Okay. So any discussion of climate change has to start with, is it actually happened? Is the science right? And of course, the answer is there's no way to be 100% certain. The climate's an unpredictable, highly nonlinear system. But if we're going to choose what we're going to base our opinions on, and especially what we base public policy on, we're not going to do better than science. I was fortunate enough to work for and with Senator John Glenn for 6 years at the Glenn School at Ohio State, and Senator Glenn always used to say, the reason the United States has been particularly great is because we have invested in education and we have invested in science and technology. Science has been very good to this country, and Senator Glenn, who actually of all the famous people I've ever met is by far the best and the nicest person, was pretty much right about that. So is science perfect? No. Is it way better than all the alternatives? I think so, and I think there's really good evidence to the contrary. Science tells us there's overwhelming consensus about the basic causes and likelihood of warming and climate change. It's happening. There's substantial consensus on sea level rise, that it's happening through a variety of pathways. How much and how fast is still highly uncertain. Not only is it uncertain because of the science, but it's uncertain because of what we do. The amount of greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere have a direct effect on how fast warming happens and how fast glaciers melt and there's thermal expansion and all the other pathways to sea level rise. So even if we understood the science perfectly, we wouldn't know exactly how fast and at what rate and what level we'd end up with sea level rise. So here's one of the graphs that you can sort of encapsulates things. It's from the US Global Assessment, and it shows if you look over to 2100, the best prediction is between 1 and 4 feet, and then you can't see it because the graphics are so bad, but it now goes up to 6.6 feet. Is the science right? Again, we can't answer that, although at this point it's pretty certain that it basically is right. But if we believe in the institutions in America that gather scientific opinion and have these debates, the National Academy of Sciences, the American Meteorological Association, the American Geophysical Union, on and on and on, have all found the scientific evidence to be overwhelmingly correct. For our purposes, recent research has shown that there's a much greater probability for significant effects on a shorter time scale. So that graph I showed you, which showed up to about 4 feet, there, in the direction of movement in scientific consensus has been to give much greater probability that it could be a lot more, a lot faster. It's not certain, and in fact, if I, and I'm an economist, not a scientist, but in reading the scientific literature, I still think that the way that science is assessing the likelihood of drastic, like 10 to 25 foot climate change within a century is still well below a quarter or 20%. It's a relatively unlikely thing, but the likelihood has been growing all along. And particularly ice sheet dynamics are key here. So the way that public policy approaches this, and I think it's the right way, is everybody is entitled to their own opinion. Everybody in this audience is going to make individual opinions based on your own assessment of what the risks are. But if we're going to make public decisions, we should base those decisions based on the distribution of peer-reviewed science. That's the best bet we've got. It's not always going to be right, but it actually has one huge benefit that nothing else has, which is it will correct itself if it's wrong. If science is wrong and anybody can prove it through scientific the method that the evidence has been misinterpreted, science will correct itself. So we're going from there. There's a high probability of human-induced climate change, that significant sea level rise is happening, and that it's increasing function of both the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases and how fast we put them in there. And then very clearly, I need to mention, because on the time scale of not of a lot of us in this audience, but on the time scale of our children and certainly our grandchildren, ice sheet dynamics are the joker in the deck, and there's at least some probability of much faster sea level rise on a century and even a 50 to 60 year time scale. Okay. So that's the quick introduction to climate science. I'm guessing it's not new to any of you, but that's what we're starting with. I'm not here to defend the science. I'm here to say what are our alternatives if the science is correct. So, what do we do about climate change? There's 4 big classes of responses. We can reduce emissions, and most of what the press has covered and most of the debate, including the coverage of the Paris Accord that's open for signature today, has been about reducing emissions. What do we do to switch to alternative energy, conserve energy, reduce methane leaks, all of those things, or carbon sequestration, finding ways to take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. Those are things which reduce our risks because it slows down the rate of climate change and what actually happens to us. It slows down those drivers. Incredibly important subject. That's not what we're here to talk about today. Another thing we can do is geoengineer a solution, anything from Edward Teller's suggestions of millions of tiny silver balloons floating in the atmosphere to giant machines that suck carbon out of the atmosphere. That is certainly a possibility that it might work. The odds of there being catastrophic and unpredicted side effects are really high. And the diplomatic and political fallout is also really kind of hard to think about. So I would put this one sort of in a minority possibility. These 2 things are important. We're not talking about them today. What we are talking about is adaptation. Climate change is happening. It's certainly on our interest to make sure it happens more slowly and less. But one way or another, if science is right, we're going to have to deal with it. We're going to have to adapt. Okay. Definition of adaptation from some article: adaptation are actions taken by individuals or systems to avoid, withstand, or take advantage of current or projected climate changes and impacts, Adaptation increases a system's vulnerability or increases its resilience to impacts. I think a much better and much simpler definition is the second one. It's a response that improves outcomes. It's when presented with some set of circumstance, what we change in the way we approach all of our decisions and the way we live and the way we conduct our businesses. What do we do so that we get better outcomes? Now this is, again, just to focus on this, very different than all those policies for reducing greenhouse gases. This is totally different than, driving a Prius instead of a Humvee or, switching to solar hot water heater. Really important, different question. Okay. Adaptation expenditures have a couple of big advantages in terms of trying to implement policy in the current environment. A huge one is when we expend resources and money to reduce greenhouse gases, through carbon taxes or other things, we don't get any of those benefits, right? The benefits go to people in other countries and in future generations who just don't have to deal with the amount of climate change that we're creating when we do that. And for what each of us does, the impact is very small, although obviously collectively it mounts up to something huge and important. Adaptation is different. When we take actions to adapt locally, climate-proofing infrastructure, moving inland, building our houses higher, anything we do to adapt to sea level rise, those benefits stay local. We see those benefits, so that's a huge advantage. It's one thing to ask people to make sacrifices and to spend money and raise taxes for something that's going to be diffused throughout the world and we're not going to see anything from it. It's another thing to say, we're going to do these things here, and we're going to replace your septic systems because of a rising water table so that you can stay in your houses longer, and those benefits stay local. So that's a reason why adaptation is a really positive and hopeful focus for climate policy, is that it's much more possible for people to take actions and see those benefits. And then second, unlike with trying to totally change our energy system, we're dealing with the kinds of problems we've always dealt with anyway. We've always had floods, we've always had droughts, we've always had severe erosion. All these things are things that we have both individual and policy responses to. They're going to happen more, they're going to be more serious. It's definitely a new regime we're dealing with, but we don't have to invent entirely new policies or new ways of thinking necessarily to deal with them. We just have to evolve what we've figured out over the years. So for these two reasons, the fact that adaptation actions have a high payoff locally and the match between expenditures and benefits is direct, there actually is more chance to get local buy-in and local action. So that's an advantage. Okay. Big thing about adaptation, moving into the meat of the talk here, is it's not new, right? People talk about adaptation, and sometimes you sort of hear planning process as if this is something we have to do. We have to do it right now. We've never done it. Well, people have always adapted, right? I mean, that's basically what evolution is a process of adaptation. Especially on the coast in this changing environment, you can look back at the history of the Outer Banks, and there's always been significant adaptation. My favorite example is Diamond City, North Carolina, which was on the Core Banks for many years. It was a fishing village. There was a hurricane in 1899, and by 1902, the entire Diamond City had picked up and moved to Harker's Island, lock, stock, and barrel. Nobody was left, right, in 3 years. That's adaptation. So evolution is an adaptive process. As sea level rises and storm risks change, people are going to take actions that give them what they perceive as their best possible outcomes. That's the very definition of adaptation. So the idea that adaptation only happens as a result of policy is, I think, the wrong way to think about it. The fundamental focus of adaptation is what you and I and everybody in the room and everybody in the community does. That's where adaptation takes place. The first locus of adaptation is exactly that at the individual level. It's choice behavior. What do we choose to do? Okay? And in the example I'm going to kind of carry through this talk in terms of real estate and real estate markets locally, we choose all kinds of stuff, right? We choose, what do we build? What kind of house do we buy? How do we build it? Do we build it up? Do we make it movable? Where do we want to live? On the beach, on the sound, on a hill, somewhere far away from the ocean? What do I invest in? Given the risks that I see, where do I want my savings to be? All of those things are fundamental part of our adaptation, and they're all individual choices. They don't really have anything, it's not a planning process, it's not government telling us what to do, it's what we choose to do given the incentives that we see. We're trying to manage our risks that result from all these choices. The question mark just means there's a lot of stuff that's left off this list. It's a complicated thing that we all view differently, but the fundamental building block of adaptation is what we choose to do. The first question that comes up then is, when we do this, how smart are we about it? And there's kind of a name in the academic literature going back 30 or 40 years where it's called the dumb farmer problem. And the idea is, if you're trying to predict what a farmer is going to do, say, as rainfall patterns change, and you're trying to think, what do we do to support that in terms of research and public policy and understanding, what kinds of information are people acting on? And there's a couple of extremes. One is you just assume that the farmer is going to do exactly what they've always done. I've always planted on April 1st, I'm going to plant on April 1st now. Okay? It doesn't matter what happens, we're going to change. The record on people is pretty clear that while some people act like that, over time populations of people do not. We're not dumb. At least some of us aren't. I won't say that for me, but many of you aren't. We learn from our mistakes, we learn from experience, and we change. And so assuming people are going to do the exact same thing again and again and again, continue to build 1 foot above mean high tide on the beach, at some point is not going to happen. People will change their behavior. The opposite pole is the omniscient farmer, the idea that, okay, this information is important, and so, at an extreme, the farmer is going to be pouring through the Journal of the American Meteorological Association and doing complex probabilistic predictions of what rainfall is going to look like, and then, maximizing over some incredibly complicated set of equations. That one's equally silly, right? Nobody has time for that. And in fact, most of us just try to work off rules of thumb, and we look at what our neighbors are doing, and if something's working for somebody, we tend to copy it. And so this sort of, where you always end up in this debate is somewhere in the middle. Some people are much closer to, well, I've always done it that way, damn it, I'm going to keep doing it forever. Some people are closer to, I'm going to, get every shred of information I can. But most of us are in the middle here. We're only partly knowledgeable, so we have some information, we do the best we can with that. And then a really good way to think about it is, a lot of us are willing to use good information, but it's delayed. We're going to wait and see what everybody else does, and then maybe 10 or 15 years later, we'll follow the pack. There's benefits in that you can see what people do and what works and what doesn't. And there's risks in that by the time that happens, the early movers have reaped big rewards, and those of us who are waiting don't do as well. So this idea of how smart and how predictive people are is fundamental to trying to understand adaptive behavior. Big questions about choice and adaptation. A big one, of course, is it public or private? Is it something we do as individuals, or is it something we do collectively? A big one is do we anticipate or do we react? Do we adapt before the flood, or do we adapt after the flood? And that's something that, again, is different in different situations for different people. But it's going to be key, and in fact, sort of to presage where we're going, when you look at how real estate markets are going to react. The people that tend to be anticipatory are probably going to do better than the people that are reactive, both in terms of investing to climate-proof their property and in knowing when to get out. And then, is it something that's coordinated that we do as a group, or is it something that everybody does individual? So who adapts and when they do it? I guess if there's one thing from this talk I think is important for everybody to understand, that I think is pretty much true, is sea level rise happens gradually and it may accelerate. But it's not the case that we're all going to stay here and eventually the water will get up to the point where it's coming onto our ankles and then we'll know it's time to leave. That's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is, as sea level rises and as other climate risks and drivers change, then some climatic event, a hurricane, a nor'easter, some major erosive force, is going to cause major damages. And the risks we face from storms and hurricanes and climate hazards, together with sea level rise, are what's going to cause that devastation. And the time when key adaptive responses are going to happen, when people are really going to have the chance to change, and when economically it makes the most sense for them to change, is after a disaster. Okay? If my house is looking fine and I'm saying, gee, should I stay in my house? Or, something may be happening, maybe I should move to Asheville. Well, I've got this perfectly good house, why the heck am I going to leave? Okay. If tomorrow there's a hurricane, or let's give it all the way to July, there's a hurricane and my house is in ruins, it's like, well, gee, I can pay $200,000 to rebuild my house, or I can move to Asheville. The costs of moving to Asheville are exactly the same. The costs of staying and rebuilding the status quo are huge. So when you have that event, when you have a climate event like Hurricane Irene, that is an opportunity for adaptation. That's the key nexus that both experience and economic modeling show us is where real action takes place. Unfortunately, or fortunately, well, more unfortunately, we have a collective response which is a really nice trait, right? Where when the disaster happens, we think we're not giving into this. We're going to build back. We're not going to let nature beat us. We're going to come back the way we were. We're not giving in. And that's unfortunate, I think, because it's good to have the attitude that says we're going to come back, but the attitude that says we're going to come back and do exactly what we did before, it's kind of not the pathway to good adaptation. So just a simple cost-benefit analysis says that the economics of making a change are much better after a disaster than they are before it, and yet that's a time when psychologically it's very hard for people to deal with major changes. And so creating both a culture and a set of policies that give people the option and information and encourage them to think about making discontinuous change after storms are one of the things that we can do to really try to encourage individuals to make choices that are better for them. Okay. Adaptation, just to be clear, adaptation doesn't mean we're insulating ourselves from all of the effects of climate change. And it also doesn't mean we're just getting away from them and not doing anything. The way that economics and public policy generally think about adaptation is we've got two things you can do. One is climate change happens, we're going to have storms, we're going to have floods, we're going to be damaged. Okay, those are bad. We can just live with those. The other extreme is, we can take adaptive actions. We can build our houses 40 feet high. We can build huge seawalls on the beach. We can climate-proof our infrastructure to an incredible degree so that we're not at risk of climate change. And both of those extremes are not going to make sense by themselves. We're going to do some things that protect us, and Lord knows, that's happened over the last 25 or 30 years impressively, is that the mean base elevation of houses has gone up. We've done a better job of building roads, but we're still going to have some damages from climate change. So the formulation that we're working with is we want to minimize the sum of damages plus what we spend to reduce those damages. Okay. So that's a quick intro to the individual choice part of it, the idea that we all are making choices for ourselves that help us manage our risks and maximize what we see as what our interests are as we face these changing risks from sea level rise. Okay. Markets. I'm an economist, right? We all love markets. We economists do. I don't know about everybody else. Markets are key places where individual assessments and choices about climate risk interact. Okay, so real estate markets are key. Here's a few examples to try to get at what I'm talking about here. If I've got a house that I think is at a huge risk of flood damage, right, and the market doesn't agree, there's lots of people that think, we're not going to have floods, then I'm going to value that house less than other people, and somebody's going to buy it from me. The more people that feel like me, the lower the prices are going to be. The more people that think there's not a problem, the higher the prices are going to be. So if lots of people think that risks have increased, market prices will drop. There's some indication that may be happening in a small extent in coastal communities already. Certainly in specific coastal communities in New Jersey it has. And again, markets are important here because in terms of what you do as an individual, it doesn't, you have to make your own assessment of what sea level rise risks are and whether it's happening. But in terms of how your assets are valued, especially your house, you as an individual don't have that much control. That's something that we all collectively decide through the market. So you can think that climate change science is a bunch of crap, and you're free to act on that. But if the market internalizes that there's going to be this increased risk and coastal real estate is less valuable because of the need to factor in that it may be destroyed or may need expensive rebuilding, that's going to show up through the market. Markets are incredibly the best thing that either God or man created to diffuse information about complex events so that everybody's acting off the same set of information. And real estate markets do that really well. So another example, if there's some kinds of architecture or landscaping that are more resistant to climate risk, real estate prices will reflect that as people change their risk assessment. So possibly before Irene, the value of a house that was 2 feet above sea level relative to one that was 12 feet above sea level may have had a small differential. After Irene, that differential got much higher because the market internalized that information and people realized that their ability to live with sea level rise risks or climate risks in general would be better if they focused on certain characteristics. So again, the point here is that we can all make our individual decisions, but the market is going to aggregate those decisions and decide what our assets, our houses, our businesses, even our public assets are worth. And finally, if risks from sea level rise become very high, we could expect to see a really radical change in the way housing looks. My own prediction on this is if once people start to take this seriously, we're going to see more modular, movable housing that after a storm event could simply be put on a flatbed truck and taken somewhere else. So far I've been predicting this and it hasn't happened, but give me another couple hundred years and I might be right. But I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that individuals and markets together do a really effective job of bringing together and communicating what risks people see from real situations. Okay? And there's lots of evidence that say the way people act in markets with real money based on their own individual choices is a really good guide to how they actually feel and what they actually think is going to happen, even better than possibly what they might respond to in a poll. The political betting markets are really good examples of that. Okay. So markets are a really effective way of aggregating individual assessments and choices and disseminating information about factors that influence individual and business choices about adaptation. So this brings up the question, you know, if it's individual choices that are so critical, and if we have markets to agglomerate those individual choices and communicate them to large groups of people, why are we even talking about government policy? What's the role of government here? You know, why do we need it? Well, we do need it, and there's some really good reasons. And the reasons basically are markets are great, but they don't do everything. A really critical one is that adaptation in coastal areas does depend on what we do together in terms of infrastructure. Okay, our houses are really important, but whether, you know, the Bonner Bridge is a great example, whether our roads are going to be safe, whether our water systems, our electricity systems continue to function, the public infrastructure that we all depend on for big parts of our everyday lives, those aren't decisions we make individually, and those are things that are not left to private businesses. Those are decisions that government makes. So the provision of public goods has a huge impact on the adaptive choices we make. If I'm going to decide whether I'm going to live on the Outer Banks or not, it matters hugely to me to know, you know, if there's a flood, am I going to be able to get safely to high ground, or am I going to be stuck here because all the bridges are closed? That's one example. So just because of infrastructure, that brings governments in a really essential way, because that sets really basic incentives that guide all of our decisions. Research is another one. We have to have governments and policies to perform research into science and technology. Private enterprise won't do it. There's no incentives for private people to do broadly applicable research because they can't appropriate those gains. There's no profit in it. And in this country, we have a long, and throughout the world actually, there's a long history of public support of science, both information about risk through climate science and meteorological prediction, but equally important, investment in protective technology. Better bridges, better roads, better water systems, things that are going to be able to withstand climate risks longer than what we have now. That's a very hot field of engineering right now, and engineering schools and engineering research are broadly supported by governments. Another big one is disaster policy. Okay, this has been getting press for at least 50 years now. It's been pretty well established that if people believe they're going to be bailed out, they don't take as much precaution. If I know that somebody's going to give me 95% of the value of my house, then if it's flooded, I'm less likely to raise it. Okay, and that's broadly applicable to a lot of situations that have to do with sea level rise and the risks that come with it through water damage and erosion. If I know that I'm going to be bailed out then I'm not going to make good adaptive actions. And insurance is another one. We really don't have a private market for flood insurance in this country or for wind insurance in most of the country. Those are set by governments. And without insurance, the commercial system falls apart. The loan system doesn't work. I'm sure lots of you in this room are familiar with the fact that the National Flood Insurance Program and the North Carolina Wind Pool, whether you like them or not, are really kind of the only game in town. There really isn't private enterprise because the private insurance market doesn't want to write these policies. And that has a big effect on our ability to manage risk. If we can buy insurance, that helps us ameliorate that risk and changes the kind of adaptive choices we make. Zoning and land use regulation. Local governments can tell us, you can't build here, or your house has got to be 42 feet above sea level. Okay? Again, zoning processes are political processes and listen to input, but those are public decisions that affect private choices about adaptive action. There's public policies that react to climate change in areas that have spillover. So an example that's going to affect us here is the water system as we see more and more droughts and dry years, which is very, very, very likely to happen under climate change. And we see continued population growth in the triangle area, then there's going to be greater demands on water in those areas, and we're going to see higher temperatures and lower water levels in the Sound, which are going to affect our fisheries, our tourism, and those other things. So policies that are used to manage natural resources and energy as a result of climate change are going to affect us here. So it's another way that public policies directly affect our choices and what we can do and the way that our businesses and our houses are affected through markets. And then finally, there's equity, which is different, which simply says that, fair is fair, and that it's reasonably likely that in the United States, it's coastal areas that are going to see the biggest hits the quickest. We didn't do anything more to cause it, and so fairness says that everybody should help bail us out. Well, we'll see whether that happens. I think it's likely to happen to some extent, but then you get this big question of how do you do that, and how does that come back to affect the kinds of adaptive choices we make. A lot of the attention on adaptation around the country has been through local planning. There's all these local plans that say we have to get together and we have to have a plan for climate change. Sort of I'm getting on my high horse here and saying, well, this stuff is useful, but I think it's overblown. There's hundreds and hundreds of climate plans around the country. There's very few of them that have actually done anything other than have a plan. And I think a big reason is they don't pay attention to the fact that people and individuals are the fundamental building blocks of adaptation, not plans. So here's something I took from a California plan. If this is sort of their model of how adaptation is supposed to take place. The leaders commit to it. Then you conduct an assessment, you set a goal, you develop a plan, you implement the plan, you monitor, and then you keep doing that. These are all over the place. There's very few communities that have taken really meaningful action based on these plans, and a big reason is because the communities are, one, subject to political pressure, but more important to that, the fundamental choices are made by people. So in terms of coastal real estate, which is my example here, this is sort of that same model I just showed you. You've got sea level rise, storms, hazard risks. We take those, we have local land use law, which sets zoning and land use, and then based on that, it determines what our future housing stock looks like. How many houses we have, who lives here, that kind of stuff. Okay, in my mind, this is just not the way the world works. This is, I think, a better model, which is you have these climatic drivers, sea level rise, storms, hazard risks. They affect what we do as individuals. They affect local land use law, which then also affects what we do as individuals. And they affect federal and state policies, insurance, roads, disaster assistance. So the climatic drivers affect this whole suite of things, and then that suite of things comes back and affects our decisions, which affects the future housing stock. Okay, so it's a more complicated model, but I think it does two things. One, it shows that it's not we have plans and stuff happens. The fact is we have these climatic changes, and then through a variety of mechanisms, we all make decisions that affect what we do to adapt. In point of fact, it's more complicated than that. There's a bunch of feedback loops that make this entirely unpredictable, although really fun to model. But looking at the pathways for government action, some things that happen are public policy mediated direct effects of sea level rise and storms are affected by policy. Seawalls, beach nourishment, road construction, they all affect the risk of flooding, transportation, the risk to our houses. So there's those direct effects. There's policy-induced changes in prices and costs, insurance, energy, transportation, and water. All these things are going to be affected as climate change goes forward, and they're going to affect the choices we make. And then rights and obligations, building codes, and water quality. Okay, sorry. That was probably more time than I should have spent on that. So that was a little bit into wonkland. Okay, here's one of the second thing I'm going to tell you, though, aside from the fact that after a disaster is the time when you need to look at real change. The second thing I think is really important here is it's about when as much as it is about what. When things happen is as important. What it happens, both when and what, will depend from the interplay of market forces, individual decisions, and public policies, and that the steps we take now have a big effect on the future. Okay. So an example, Highway 12 on Hatteras, after Hurricane Irene, you had this huge gap. We had to build a temporary bridge, which still 5 years later is still there as a temporary bridge, although the water's gone for the most part. So you have this climate-induced change. What do you do about it? Okay. In the short run, it's like, how do we keep road links to the mainland open? Got to do that. But the long-run question is, what do we do and when do we do it? If we never built another bridge, right, if we said, okay, it's a gap, no road, that would impose really, really large costs on the group of people that live there and the tourism economy. It would be disastrous. Okay. Never would commit us to an enormously expensive and probably impossible proposition. There's no way we can guarantee over long periods of time that we're going to be able to keep that road open. So what do we do and when do we do it is the essence of adaptation, and the when is really important. Okay. 3 classes of responses. We can hold the road. We can just keep rebuilding it no matter what, like we've been doing all these years just south of the Bonner Bridge. We can build a more climate-resistant road at a higher upfront cost, which is what we are doing now, but it's only slightly more climate-resistant at not a huge cost. Or at some point, we can give up on having a road link, and we can figure people want to live there, they can take ferries or airplanes or maybe in the future transporter beams. Who knows? All of these might be relied on and probably will be relied on at some point. What matters is when they're relied on and when people understand and internalize those decisions so they can make good decisions about what they do. Okay, they all have critical public policy elements, but they all fundamentally depend on what individuals decide to do. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is this kind of, it's almost a logical conundrum. The better job you do in the short run of protecting people from the effects of climate change, okay, which again, you know, the Nourishment Project in Nags Head, building the better Bonner Bridge. These are all things that, certainly the first round in Nags Head, I think, is a cost-effective way of protecting property. Building the bridge is a cost-effective way of protecting tourism now, given current conditions. But the better job we do, the more we encourage people to continue in patterns of development where they depend on that bridge, where they depend on the beach. So once the beach is nourished, people continue to invest in large houses on the beachfront and continue to maintain them. Once the bridge is rebuilt, people continue to invest in housing and tourism businesses and other businesses on Hatteras Island, which means that when it gets riskier and more expensive to continue those projects, and believe me, nourishment will get more expensive, and next time the bridge needs to be rebuilt, it's going to be significantly more expensive than this time. You've got a much larger installed base of business and real estate that depend on those bridges. So you get this spiral where we protect people, they build more. They've built more, so it's worth it to protect them, and you keep going until you get to a crash. If we didn't do that, if we said, no, we're not going to continue to protect you, there would be greater short-run costs, but people would take adaptive actions such that, you know, they invested in the kind of businesses where they could live with ferries or airplanes. They move off the island. They'll take actions that might, in the long run, create better outcomes or certainly different outcomes. So you get this weird result that's very hard to work through that says it can make really good short-term economic sense to invest in climate protection, but you're really running a risk of bad long-term outcomes when you do it because everybody's reacting to being protected and thinking everything's okay. Once that's there, you've got political and economic support for continuing to do that. Yeah?
Maybe we shouldn't have put the first bridge up to start with. We created the problem.
Yeah, well, we're in it, and that's right. But the question is, how do we get out of it, okay? So the resulting pattern of building, so this is what we mean by path dependence. We're choosing a path, and once we're on that path, we're kind of stuck with it, okay? So you've got these different alternatives. They both create different paths. I don't think there's any simple answer of which one is better or worse in a lot of circumstances. They're different, but they definitely matter a lot to what happens to our communities in the short run and in the 25 to 50-year time horizon. Okay. So again, it's the same example. If younger residents think that that bridge is going to be there, they'll continue to live there and invest. If they think the bridge is gone, they're not going to be able to take their kids to Nags Head for soccer games or dentists, then people will start to depopulate Hatteras Island. People will still live there, there'll still be tourism, but it will be different. It will be a very different future. Okay. So I've somehow missed one of my slides here, which I'll apologize for. But again, the third frame that I think is really important to think about, and it comes back to time, is for those of us that live here, and is everybody here an Outer Banks resident, right? So how many people still expect to be living here in a year? Lord knows I do. How many people think that somebody's going to be living on the spot where your house is in 3 centuries? 3 centuries. Probably not, right? Combination of erosion and sea level rise. So we're all going to be here next year, and we probably all know people, Lord knows I do, who live in the Triangle who go, why do you people live out there? You should leave. Well, it would be really stupid to leave, right? I mean, there's billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure here that are still going to be here next year and in 2 years and in 10 years. It would be economically stupid and stupid for our lifestyles to pick up and leave. But we can't commit to being here forever either. And it's getting riskier and riskier. And so the essence of adaptation is what happens between next year, when we all know we're going to be here, and 3 centuries where we really don't think our great-great-great-great-grandchildren are going to be out here. That's the essence of adaptation. And that's adaptive choices that are being made under huge uncertainty about the level of sea level rise, uncertainty about what we're going to do to stop it, uncertain about the technologies we'll have to protect ourselves. So I wanted to get that out there. So then there's question of path dependence. I guess the next point I wanted to get across is that one of the things that makes this so hard is in public policy, there's always this tension between being clear so people can make good decisions or changing and adapting as we get new information. And this is particularly true for climate change. Private sector and individuals like clear signals, right? We want to know exactly what's going to happen. Is the Bonner Bridge going to be open or not? Okay. Are we going to outlaw coal or not before Wall Street invests in new power plants? All those things, people and investors want certainty. But we're dealing with a situation where adaptive management is called for, where we're going to be getting new information all the time, and we ought to be able to act on that information. The problem there is, if we've announced a policy and now we say, oh, there's new information, we're changing it, people have made bad investments. So good policy under uncertainty requires policy be changed as better information becomes available, but we like clear signals. What do we do? There's really no good answer here. There actually is a technical answer that can work reasonably well for a problem like the Bonner Bridge, and it goes like this. We kind of say, okay, we're rebuilding the bridge, or we're going to keep Highway 12 open to Hatteras. We don't know how long that's going to take because we don't know what those climate risks are going to be. But what we can do is we can technically announce a policy that's hinged on something that's publicly observable. So we can say, we are going to continue to keep this road, committing to keep the road open until sea level rise gets to be 40 inches above where it was in 2016. And here's the definition of sea level rise. And everybody knows it. And if it happens in 20 years, people will see it happening. If it happens 100 years, people will be able to adapt to that signal. Okay? The problem with that is that our ability as a species to make a policy commitment like that and keep it is pretty much nil. We're really bad at it, right? We've never done it. So any kind of political commitment like that has no credibility, and you can't do it. So this is an example which I think is an example of what we're facing with climate change generally, which is it's a real achievement of both science and public policy that in many ways, certainly in terms of reducing greenhouse gases, compared with where we were a century or two ago, we actually understand the problem and actually have the policy tools to deal with a lot of the climate risks. But we certainly don't seem to have the political ability to get together to make those decisions. And this is an example of the kind of policy that I think would make sense and would be interesting to pursue, but is pretty much off the table because there's no way to credibly commit. And then finally, there's this question of compensation. If people on coasts are made worse off by sea level rise, and we didn't cause it, then there's going to be some tendency to say, okay, we're going to try to help you. Okay. It matters a lot how that help is made. So you want to provide resources in a way that don't distort individual decisions. A natural thing to do after a flood or after a major erosion event is to help people get back on their feet by rebuilding their houses, or to rebuild a road, or to say, well, your flood insurance has gone way up, but we're going to subsidize your flood insurance because it's not fair that you're having to pay all this money because you were unfortunate enough to live at the coast. That's real aid, and it does help people, but it also distorts their decisions. It makes it easier for them to keep doing the same stuff they were. It makes it harder for them to adapt in ways that might make sense in the long run. The alternatives are providing compensation in ways that don't distort those incentives. Education, giving people lump sums so that they can choose whether to rebuild their house or whether they're going to use that money to move inland. Politically, so far, that's been much more difficult to do than targeted aid that distorts decisions. So again, if compensation is going to be a part of U.S. adaptation policy, it's going to be really, really important to try to think through what is the way that actually helps the people who are deserving and who needs help, but doesn't distort their decisions so they keep making the same mistakes over and over again. I guess the takeaways from this talk are adaptation's an uncertain combination of market and individual choices and public policies. They kind of leapfrog each other back and forth, but it's the combination of those two things interplaying that affects what our communities look like and what actions we take to adapt to this major change that's coming at some uncertain time in the future. That planning is an important but not uniquely central tool, and that in fact, in a lot of ways, I think that focusing on local plans has taken attention away from where I think the real locus of action on adaptation is, which is individual choices. That when things happen is really important. It's as important as what happens. And that current actions are essential because they create a path-dependent future that can affect choices over a long period. We're certainly facing risks that are affected by climate, but probably sea level rise is not going to drastically affect what any of us do in the next 10 years. But the metaphor of this tanker is, if you've ever been out on the water near a tanker, you know that tankers take like 3 miles to turn, right? A tanker can see you in the water 2 miles ahead of you, and they can't turn. They're going to run over you. They take a long time to turn, okay? So the human systems take a long time to turn. They have this huge amount of momentum. The way we have our lives organized on the Outer Banks, depending on road transportation, depending on protection from floods, the way our houses are built, that's tough to change. And we probably don't need to change it tomorrow or next year. But if we don't start to turn the tanker now, then in 10 and 15 and 20 years, we're going to find ourselves in the exact same position. We're going to be saying, oh, well, now the risks are higher, but we still have 20 years before we can do anything without major changes. Or we can start to look at policies that turn the tanker now, that have people think when they renovate, when they make basic decisions, when they think about what policies they're going to support for transportation, think ahead of what's going to happen in 20 years if the sea level is 8 inches higher and our risks from floods and erosion are that much higher. So the takeaway from this metaphor and probably from this talk is I really can't tell you exactly what the right thing to do, although I do think that fundamentally making people aware that they're going to face the consequences of sea level rise in their own individual outcomes in terms of their wealth and safety is important. But even if we're not seeing immediate effects, the decisions we make now and for the next decade are going to have a fundamental effect on how well all of us and our communities are going to be able to adapt to sea level rise. So that's what I had to say to you guys. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm delighted to hear comments or try to answer questions. Thank you.